It was Halloween night when the mirror started breathing again. I remember the sound before the sight, a faint rhythm, like someone exhaling behind glass. The candle on the dresser bent its flame, the air tightened, and for a moment, I thought the house itself was holding its breath. At first, I told myself it was nothing, an old window frame shifting with the wind, the creak of old wood under the weight of autumn rain. But mirrors don't move, and they certainly don't sigh your name. That night, the air in the house felt different, heavier, charged, almost aware. It had that same stillness that comes before a storm, when everything waits for the first strike of thunder. Only this storm wasn't outside. It was inside the walls, inside me. I remember reaching out, brushing my fingers against the cool surface of the mirror. It was damp, as if someone had just breathed against it from the other side. And faintly, impossibly, I saw another shape beside mine, not clear enough to name, but enough to make my heart forget its rhythm. I didn't scream. People imagine fear is loud, but real fear is silent. It settles behind your ribs and listens. That was the night everything I had buried began to move. Every silence I had sealed. Every memory I swore I could live without. Before I go on, tell me, where are you listening from tonight? Every place carries its own ghosts, its own memories that breathe when the world goes quiet. I love knowing where these stories find you. So share your city, your corner of the world, and if you feel what I feel, subscribe. Stay with me until the silence tells its truth. My name is Beth Sullivan. I'm 58 years old, and I've lived in this house for nearly 30 years. It stands at the end of Maple Lane, surrounded by oaks that drop their leaves like small brown confessions. When I first moved here, I loved the quiet, the way mornings began with birdsong and ended with the hum of distant traffic, fading like an old lullaby. Now the quiet feels different. It isn't peace anymore. It's absence. People in this town still wave when they drive by, still smile politely when they see me at the post office. They don't ask questions. Maybe they've forgotten, or maybe they just don't want to remember the story that lives in this house. It's strange how a single place can hold the entire geography of a life, the laughter, the arguments, the empty rooms. This house knows me better than I do. It's seen every version of me, the mother, the wife, the woman who learned to cook for one, and the one who learned to stop expecting answers. I used to think Halloween was harmless, paper ghosts, carved pumpkins, the laughter of children drifting through the night. But after 2024, that night stopped being about costumes. It became a mirror, a portal between what I wanted to forget and what refused to stay buried. It started, as most hauntings do, quietly. A knock at the door that no one answered. And a box, small enough to be ignored, but impossible to forget. It arrived on a gray morning, 2 days before Halloween 2024. No sender, no card, just my name, written in faded blue ink. The handwriting looked familiar, though I couldn't say why. The B curved too gently. The S leaned slightly left, like someone who once knew me had tried to remember how to spell my name by heart. I placed it on the kitchen counter, beside the bowl of apples I never eat. I told myself I'd open it later, but later never came. After certain losses, you stop opening things. Letters, doors, conversations. You start saving your strength for survival. So I left the box there, like a quiet guest I wasn't ready to meet. Days passed. October dimmed, and the box waited. Every time I walked past it, I felt something. Not fear, exactly. Recognition. A faint, magnetic pull that whispered, "You already know what's inside." That's the thing about grief. It doesn't stay buried. It just waits for permission to breathe again. I tried to ignore it, filled my days with small rituals, watering plants that no longer grew, wiping the same surface twice, pretending the smell of dust meant the house was still alive. But at night, the stillness changed. The silence wasn't empty anymore. It hummed. Sometimes it was a low vibration, like the sound of a heartbeat through walls. Other times, it was soft tapping, rhythmic, patient, as if someone were practicing knocking. I checked the windows, the doors, the attic. Nothing. Yet each night, the sound grew closer, and then came the mirror. That was when I realized the house wasn't keeping secrets from me. It was giving them back. You see, this house has belonged to me for 30 years, but before that, it belonged to us. To me, to my husband Michael, and to our daughter Claire. Claire. Just saying her name feels like opening a door I swore I'd never touch again. She would have turned 30 this year. I can still see her, running barefoot across the wooden floor, hair the color of light through honey, cheeks flushed from laughter. She had this way of making the air brighter, of making silence feel safe. And then one day, she was gone. They called it an accident. Such a small word for such a large absence. A word that looks harmless written down, but destroys everything it touches. After she died, Michael and I began to disappear from each other too. Not suddenly, but slowly, like pages fading in sunlight. He left a few years later. I stayed, maybe out of guilt, maybe because leaving felt like confirming that she was never coming back. In time, people stopped mentioning her. Even I stopped saying her name out loud. But silence doesn't erase love. It just turns it into an echo. So when that box appeared last October, I felt the echo rise again. I told myself it was impossible. But a small, unspoken part of me, the part that still dreams in her voice, whispered that maybe impossibility was the only place she could still reach me. For days, I avoided it. I'd wake, see the box on the counter, and feel that quiet pressure behind my ribs, like a hand waiting to be held. I thought if I ignored it long enough, it would vanish. But grief doesn't vanish. It waits until you remember. On the night of October 31st, I lit a single candle. The house smelled of smoke and old wood. Outside, children laughed, their voices distant, carried by the wind. I almost felt normal, until the lights flickered, once, twice, and the mirror began to breathe. That sound again, slow, deliberate, familiar. It wasn't the house settling. It was something awakening. I walked down the hallway, the floorboards cold beneath my feet. Each step felt heavier, like walking through water. The mirror waited at the end of the corridor, the candlelight trembling across its surface. And then, on the glass, a single breath appeared. A foggy bloom shaped like a child's exhale. Right beneath it, written in the mist, a word formed. Mom. I stood frozen. The candle shook in my hand, wax dripping onto my wrist. The air smelled like rain on metal, and from somewhere inside the walls, the sound came again, soft, steady, impossibly familiar. I whispered her name, and for the first time in 20 years, the house answered back. I didn't touch the mirror again. I wiped the glass with the sleeve of my sweater, as if a clean surface could make the breath disappear. But even after the fog faded, the word lingered inside me like a match still warm between two fingers. I went back to the kitchen and turned on every light. People say light makes things simpler. It doesn't. It only shows you what you've been living with. The box waited where I'd left it, by the window, next to the bowl of wrinkled apples, and the plant I kept watering even though it had already given up. I stood there a long time, telling myself the same tidy sentences adults use when they're scared. Drafts happen. Old wood moves. You didn't see what you think you saw. I made tea I didn't drink. I washed a clean dish. I opened the fridge as if memory were something cold I could cool further. And then I did what I've always done when the world starts to bend. I made lists. The first list said, "Call electrician, oil hinges, check windows." The second list stayed private. "Don't say her name. Don't open the box. Don't look at the mirror again." I tried the radio to fill the air, but the station hissed and broke, caught in that narrow place between static and song. For a moment, I thought I heard a child's voice pressed under the noise. A syllable, a breath, a soft almost. I switched it off, too hard. Silence flared back like a light I couldn't dim. In the morning, I took the trash out early and checked the porch, looking for footprints. A note, anything that could anchor the box to a living hand. The rain had washed the steps clean. No evidence of a delivery, no tire marks on the street. Nothing but leaves plastered to concrete like pressed lungs. I told myself I'd ask Mrs. Eaton next door if she'd seen anyone. I didn't. There are questions that once asked make your world official. If no one had left the box, then what remained? So I chose the easier version of courage. I dusted the bookshelves. I rearranged the frames with photos turned face down inside them. If I kept my hands moving, maybe memory would find another room to haunt. But the house had its own rhythm, and it started small. The clock in the hallway, the one that hasn't worked since the year Michael left, ticked once, and then again. By the third tick, I had to lean against the wall just to stay upright. It settled at a time that didn't change. 9:17. The minute the doctor had written on the file 20 years ago. I told myself the same lie I've told for years. Coincidence. Coincidence wears so many faces it almost looks like truth. That afternoon the phone rang and stopped after one ring. When I checked the call log, there was nothing. Just a blank line between names. I left a message on my own voicemail, saying nothing at all, just to hear a human sound answer me back. All day the box breathed the corner of my eye. I avoided it the way you avoid mirrors after you've cried. I opened drawers instead, searching for an anchor, paper clips, rubber bands, the ordinary weight of a life that believes itself untouchable. At the back of the sideboard, I found something I hadn't seen in years. Claire's little pink cassette player with its cracked headphone. A bright sticker still flaked on the plastic. A star, its gold almost rubbed away by small thumbs. The sight of it was a door unlatched. I sat down with the player in my lap and felt the old gravity return, that thud of love and grief that arrives at the same time and refuses to separate. I pressed the play button out of habit. It clicked and stayed silent. No battery, of course. How neat, how merciful, how cruel. I could have gone to the store, found the right size, made something happen. Instead, I placed the player on the table the way you place flowers on a grave. Gently, too late. The day folded into evening. Children started collecting at the end of Maple Lane in loose constellations of capes and plastic masks. Every year I leave a bowl of candy on the porch with a note that says, "Take 2." It's easier than opening the door. It's easier than pretending I don't look for a costume I'll never see again. The porch light clicked on by itself at 6. I didn't remember setting a timer. I didn't turn it off. By 7, laughter rose and fell like a tide. Somewhere a dog barked until its voice turned hoarse. Somewhere a father said not yet, not that house, not tonight. I closed the curtains and sat in the dark with the box. The tape inside it was heavier than I expected. A black rectangle with a handwritten label white as old teeth. OCT 31, 2024. No other words, no name, no song. Just the date like a door. My thumb found the little holes and felt the tension of the ribbon wound inside. I remembered Claire's hands doing the same thing. That gentle turn when the tape unspooled and got stuck, her mouth a small O of concentration. She used to record everything, the cat purring, rain against the window, me reading her a story she already knew by heart. "Just in case the world forgets," she'd say, with the seriousness only children can carry without breaking. I should have been grateful for the coincidence. a tape when I had a player, evidence when I had questions. But grief is allergic to symmetry. It trusts nothing that looks tidily arranged. I told myself I would listen tomorrow. Morning steadies you. Night bends you. I put the cassette back in its paper sleeve and slid it into the drawer where I keep warranties and old manuals for appliances I no longer own. A place for things you might need later and hope you never do. I washed the mug I hadn't used. I turned off the lamp. I did not look down the hallway. Bed is a place for surrender, unless surrender is what you fear. I lay still, counting the space between my breaths, and thought of every excuse the mind invents to keep the heart from opening. I'd listen if someone were here with me. I'd listen if Michael called. I'd listen if the mirror stayed quiet till morning. The house answered me with a soft expansion, the way old wood swells when the temperature shifts. Then the whisper came. Not a voice exactly. More like the memory of one traveling through air that still remembers it. I turned my head, and the mirror, in the dark, shone back a dim oval of candlelight. But the candle was out. The clock ticked once at 9:17 and stayed. The refrigerator hummed a note lower than usual. In the corner, the plant's dry leaves rustled with no help from wind. I sat up, suddenly certain of something I couldn't name. You get to know the difference between coincidence and choreography. One happens to you. The other happens for you. Neither asks permission. I went back to the kitchen and opened the drawer. The tape felt colder than the metal handle. I took Claire's little player too, then changed my mind and brought the big deck from the living room, the one that still has speakers that remember what music tastes like. I set everything on the dining table. Old wood is a good witness. It remembers without interrupting. I searched another drawer for batteries and found a single pack, unopened, the expiration date a year past. I laughed without sound. It felt like someone had planned a test I hadn't studied for. When the player clicked to life, the room deepened, as if sound itself had weight. I held the tape over the slot and didn't move. People assume resistance is anger or shouting. Mine is tenderness. It's the gentlest refusal in the world. It says, I love you so much I'm afraid to know. I wanted a sign. Something that would let me say later, to someone who wouldn't believe me. See? But the house had given me enough. The mirror, the clock, the breath. I lowered the tape into the deck and pressed it into place. The soft clack felt final, like putting a key back into a lock that no one's used in years. I didn't press play. I sat there with my hands in my lap and tried to think of every reason not to move. What if it's nothing? What if it's everything? What if hearing her means losing her again? Somewhere outside, a child squealed and then laughed, the sound running toward a car. Somewhere inside, the heater coughed and settled. My throat softened like it does before you speak to someone who might not answer. I reached for the lamp and turned it off. The room darkened to that gentle amber that remembers flame. I waited until my eyes found the outline of the player. I placed my finger on the play button and rested there, the way you press your palm to a door before entering a room you loved in another life. I almost pressed. Almost is a continent. I lived there for a long time. Instead, I took my hand back and folded it over the other. I told the air what I could not yet tell the tape. If this is you, if you are here, I'm listening. I'm trying. The answer wasn't sound. It was the air itself. Warmer, nearer, patient. You can hear patience if you grow quiet enough. I picked up the tape again and turned it in my hands like a small, careful animal. My thumb brushed the label, OCT 31, 2024, and a corner lifted, revealing something written underneath in pencil, faint and almost erased. A single word in a child's hand, the letters eager, uneven, brave, home. I closed my eyes. The kind of prayer that people pray without believing they're praying found its way through me. When I opened them, The mirror down the hall glowed slightly, as if it had kept its own candle for me. I stood, carrying the player with both hands, and walked toward it. At the threshold of the hallway, I stopped. There's always a point before a beginning that still belongs to the life you understand. Then your foot crosses, and you belong to something else. I turned back, set the player on the table again, and returned to the kitchen. I took the box, empty now, just cardboard and breath, and folded its flaps inward until they made a small, soft click. You have to close one door cleanly before another will open. Then I went back to the table, sat down, and placed my finger on the button. I didn't count to 3. I didn't think of consequences or proofs. I only thought of a girl with honey-colored hair who believed sound could save the world from forgetting. And in the hush between fear and faith, I pressed play. The tape began with silence. Not the kind that lives between words, but the kind that feels older than sound itself. I thought maybe it was blank, a cruel joke, or the echo of something that never recorded. But then, there it was, a breath, soft, rhythmic, familiar. It wasn't my breath, and it wasn't the house's. It was smaller, lighter, the fragile inhale of a child who trusts the world. I knew that sound. I had carried it inside my own body once. Mom. Just that. Barely a whisper. Barely a word. But it folded the air into something holy. I pressed pause before I could hear more. My hands were shaking too much to stay still. I sat in the dark and listened to the silence that followed the voice. The silence wasn't empty. It was waiting. When I pressed play again, I expected a message, a song, something rational. What came instead was the house. The same house I was sitting in. Its sounds caught on tape like a confession. The creak of the back door. The slow heartbeat of the old clock at 9:17. And underneath it all, the soft drip of the kitchen faucet that hasn't worked since Michael tried to fix it years ago. It wasn't possible. No one had been here to record it. And yet, the sound was too precise to be coincidence. It was as if the walls themselves had spoken into the microphone. Then came humming. A tune so familiar I thought I'd dreamed it. Claire's lullaby, the one I made up when she couldn't sleep. She used to ask me to sing it slower every night, until the melody stretched into something infinite. And now, through the static, she was the one humming it back to me. My body forgot how to breathe. Tears didn't fall right away. They waited. The way rain waits at the edge of a cloud. Heavy, but patient. I wanted to stop listening. I also wanted to crawl inside the sound and never come back out. Halfway through the tape, the sound of footsteps joined the melody. Slow, deliberate steps, wood against wood. They moved from one room to another, growing closer, clearer, until I could hear the rhythm of her bare feet across the floor. I turned toward the hallway. It was empty. But the air had changed. It had weight now, like the room had taken a breath of its own. The candle flame leaned sideways, as if someone had walked past. And then I heard it. A faint tap on the wall behind me. 2 knocks, a pause, then 1. The same pattern she used when she wanted to come into my room as a child. Our secret code, the one no one else knew. I whispered, "Claire?" And the player stopped on its own. The tape didn't click or rewind. It just stopped, like it had heard me. I sat there frozen, every cell in my body leaning toward something I couldn't see. The house held its breath with me. No sound, no creak, no hum. Just stillness. So deep it felt like a question. After a while, I pressed play again. The tape didn't respond. Nothing. I rewound it. The wheels spun, obedient, mechanical. But when I tried again, all I heard was wind. a long, soft wind that grew louder until it filled the room. But it wasn't coming from the speakers. It was coming from the hall. I turned. The mirror glowed faintly in the dark, a soft amber shimmer, like firelight behind smoke. I carried the player with me, afraid to put it down, afraid to take it closer. Each step toward the mirror made the sound of wind rise, not angry, not violent, just alive. And in the reflection, I saw movement, not a shadow, something gentler, like light remembering how to take shape. For a heartbeat, I thought I saw her, 9 years old, hair tangled from sleep, standing beside the piano she never learned to play. Her reflection blinked, then blurred, dissolving back into candlelight. I waited for fear to come, but it didn't. What came instead was warmth. That unmistakable warmth of holding someone's hand on a winter morning. It surrounded me, moved through me, stayed. I wanted to speak, but the words caught in my throat. Apologies don't sound right when they arrive 20 years late. So I whispered what I could. I remember you. The mirror cleared, the air softened, and from the cassette player, still resting in my hands, the tape began to play again on its own. Only one line this time. Not a recording, not an echo. A voice as close as breath. I know. I fell to my knees. It wasn't grief anymore. It wasn't even disbelief. It was recognition, the ancient kind that feels like coming home to something that never really left. The tape kept running long after that, filling the room with the sound of the sea. Except there is no sea near Maple Lane, just trees and wind, and one mother finally listening. If this moment reached you, let it echo. Press like, not for the story, but for the love that refuses to end. Every click is a heartbeat that tells the algorithm we still believe in tenderness. The sea faded slowly, like a dream trying to remember itself. For a while, I sat there and let the waves wash through the room, though there was no water, no tide, no reason at all for the sound to exist. When the tape clicked off, the silence it left behind was too honest to ignore. It felt like the pause between truth and confession. I stayed on the floor until dawn. The candle had burned down to a stub, a tiny crater of wax holding a last whisper of light. The mirror stood calm, blank again, its surface clear as if nothing had ever happened. And yet, the air still shimmered faintly, the way air does after lightning, charged, but not cruel. I wanted to believe it was over. But the thing about answers is that they rarely arrive alone. They bring the next question folded inside. By morning, I couldn't sit still. The box lay open on the table, the tape rewound, the label, OCT 31, 2024, now smeared where my fingers had held it too long. I kept turning it in my hands, wondering who had sent it. There were only 3 people who could have known enough to make it matter: Michael, Dr. Hayes, or me. Michael had remarried years ago. He sends Christmas cards with clean handwriting and no return address. The last one came in 2017, a photo of him with 2 children whose eyes didn't look like his. He's good at starting over. He never learned how to stay. Dr. Hayes had been the one on duty the night Claire died. He said words like complication and respiratory failure, his voice the texture of paperwork. But something in his eyes, the way they flickered when he looked at me, had never stopped echoing. A question unasked is a door left ajar. I didn't want to reopen anything, but silence had already done it for me. By noon, I found myself in the attic, surrounded by boxes that smelled of dust and unfinished years. I hadn't been up there since Michael left. The air was thick, dry, almost granular. And somewhere behind the old suitcases and Christmas ornaments, I found a box labeled in my own handwriting, Beth Sullivan, 2005. Inside were things I remembered putting away, drawings, notebooks, a broken bracelet. But under those, there was a sealed envelope, brittle at the edges. It had the hospital's letterhead, and my name typed cleanly on the front. For some reason, I'd never opened it. I'd kept it buried with the other ghosts. The polite kind, the ones we feed with denial. My fingers shook as I tore it open. Inside was a thin stack of papers, medical forms, signatures, and one note. Handwritten, not typed. It was a message from Dr. Hayes. Mrs. Sullivan, I'm writing this off record, because I couldn't say it then. Your daughter didn't die from the injury alone. There was a delay, one that shouldn't have happened. The wrong file was pulled. By the time I realized it was too late. I take responsibility. I've thought of her every day since. I thought you should know. There was a second page. It wasn't from him. It was from Michael. Beth, you weren't supposed to see this. It wasn't the doctor's fault. It was mine. I froze. I signed the wrong release. I told them to wait, thinking she'd wake up. You were in the hallway. I didn't want you to blame yourself. So I took the silence for both of us. The paper trembled in my hands. The words were 20 years old, but they cut with the freshness of yesterday. I had built my grief on the wrong foundation. All those years I blamed chance, fate, God, anyone but us. And all along, the truth had been sitting quietly in a box with our name on it. I sank to the floor. The attic groaned with the wind. Somewhere below, a door clicked shut, though I was alone in the house. I should have felt anger, betrayal even, but what came was softer, stranger, relief. Because truth, even when it hurts, still feels like air after drowning. I read the letters again until my eyes blurred. When I looked up, dust motes spun through a shaft of light that cut across the attic floor. It looked like movement. Small, playful, familiar. And for a second, I heard it again. Her humming. That same lullaby, only this time, it wasn't on tape. It was here. Present. Alive. I whispered into the air, I know what happened. And the attic settled, as if it had been waiting for me to say it. Downstairs, the clock started again. 9:18, the minute after, the one we never reached. I carried the letters to the kitchen and laid them on the table beside the cassette player. The tape was still inside, quiet now, like it had done its part. I pressed play anyway. No sound came out, just that faint hiss of blank space between recordings. But the silence felt full, like listening to someone breathe from the next room. I sat there for hours, reading and rereading the letters until I knew every word by heart. And somewhere between the 5th and 6th reading, I realized the truth wasn't about fault. It was about delay, the small hesitations that separate life from loss. Michael hesitated. The doctor hesitated. And I had too. All these years, hesitating to forgive any of us. The light outside turned gold, then copper, then a deep bruised violet. The kind of light that only October understands. I opened the window, and the air rushed in, cold and new. The curtain lifted, brushing against my shoulder like a touch that meant no harm. And in that simple gesture, I felt her again. Not haunting me, not asking for anything. Just there, the way wind exists without needing to be seen. I took the letters, folded them carefully, and placed them back inside the empty cardboard box. Then I wrote one of my own. It wasn't to the doctor. It wasn't to Michael. It was to her. Claire, I remember now. All of it. The truth doesn't hurt as much as forgetting did. If you came home to return this to me, you can rest. You did nothing wrong. Neither did I. We were all just waiting for the same breath. I signed it and set it beside the mirror, and as the last trace of daylight slipped away, the glass caught the reflection of the paper and shimmered once, just once, before settling into calm again. For the first time in 20 years, the house didn't feel haunted. It felt awake. I waited until the light left the walls completely before going upstairs. The house was quiet again, but not with that aching, haunted quiet of before. This was different. It felt like the air after a storm, when the sky hasn't yet decided if it will clear or cry again. Every step I took on the staircase seemed softer, as if the wood knew where I was going. Claire's room was at the end of the hall. For 20 years I'd walked past it without looking in. It had become a border, the invisible kind that grief builds out of habit. The door was still the same pale blue we painted together when she was 7, the color she said reminded her of happy sky. The handle was cool to the touch, colder than I remembered. I turned it slowly. The door opened with a sigh. Dust carried the faint scent of lavender and paper. Nothing had changed. The small bed with its white quilt, the bookshelf tilted under the weight of fairy tales, the lamp shaped like a moon that hadn't worked in years. The room had been waiting, not for her, but for me. I stood in the doorway, afraid to enter, afraid that stepping inside would undo the fragile peace the house had finally learned. But something gentle brushed against my shoulder, like a thread of air guiding me forward. I crossed the room. The floor creaked once, then quieted, as if it understood. I sat on the edge of her bed. The quilt folded beneath my weight, releasing a soft puff of dust that sparkled in the faint light from the hallway. I placed my hands in my lap and looked around. Everything felt smaller, the way places do when you return to them as a different person. There was a photograph on the dresser, Claire, missing her 2 front teeth, holding the kitten we never managed to keep. The frame was slightly crooked. I reached out and straightened it. That small motion broke something inside me. A dam, a silence, a lifetime of unsaid words. "I thought I buried you," I whispered. "But I buried myself." The words fell into the room like stones dropped into water, soft ripples that took their time returning to stillness. For a moment, I expected the air to move, the candle to flicker, some small proof that she was listening. But nothing moved, and that nothing felt perfect. I closed my eyes and spoke again. "I forgive him." The name didn't need to be said. It lived in the quiet between sentences. I forgive myself too. That one took longer. My voice caught on the word myself, like fabric on a nail. The tears came slow, not violent like before. They rolled down my face without urgency, just gravity, simple and sure. I let them fall onto the quilt, into the small, stitched stars she loved so much. I thought of all the years I'd tried to be strong, to be still, to be untouched. But grief doesn't need strength. It needs softness. I began to speak to her the way I used to when she couldn't sleep, quietly, almost in rhythm. "Do you remember the lullaby? The one that slowed the world down until you could dream?" My voice wavered. I hummed the first few notes. They sounded different, older, rounder, like the melody had been waiting for me to grow into it. And then I felt it. Not a presence beside me, but around me. Warm, wide, forgiving. A feeling that wasn't made of air or light, but of recognition. As if everything that had ever been unsaid finally understood itself. "I'm sorry," I whispered. "For hiding you. For hiding me. For thinking love could be buried." The warmth deepened. It moved through my chest, up my throat, down my arms, until my hands glowed faintly in the dim light. I looked at them and realized they weren't shaking anymore. The tremor I'd carried for years, that quiet quake of fear, was gone. The clock in the hallway ticked once, not 9:17 this time, 9:18, the minute after, the one that never came. It had arrived at last. I closed my eyes and spoke her name, not as a plea, not as a prayer, but as a homecoming. Claire. The sound filled the room like sunlight spilling through open curtains. And for the briefest moment, I could swear the air shimmered, gold, soft, breathing. Not to prove she was there, but to show that I was. I stayed there for a long time, humming the lullaby to no one and to everyone. When I finally stood, the mirror on her dresser caught my reflection. For the first time in decades, I didn't look haunted. I looked whole. I turned off the lamp, left the door open, and walked back down the hallway. The air felt lighter. Each breath was steady, clean. As I passed the mirror in the corridor, it no longer breathed. It only reflected. And that, I realized, was enough. Downstairs, the cassette player waited on the table. The tape was still inside, silent, but not dead. I pressed stop. The small click sounded like punctuation at the end of a story I had spent half my life writing. I whispered to the room, "She's home." And for the first time in 20 years, I understood that so was I. Tell me in the comments, who came back for you? Maybe it was a scent that found you in the kitchen, or a voice you heard when no one was there. These stories aren't mine alone. They belong to anyone who's ever loved past the end. I read every one. They keep this space alive. The next morning broke clean and gray, the kind of light that doesn't promise anything but keeps its word anyway. I made tea, this time to drink, and carried it into the kitchen. The house was quiet, but it no longer sounded empty. It breathed with me, slow, steady, at peace. On the table lay the tape, the box, and the letters. 3 artifacts from a story that had finally told itself. I touched each one gently, as if thanking them for surviving long enough to be heard. The tape was cold in my hand, heavy for something so small. When I tilted it, the light caught the faint pencil word hidden beneath the label. Home. For years I believed closure was something that arrived on its own. But closure is a choice, an act, not a miracle. And this morning I knew what needed to be done. I opened the window to let the air in. The wind carried the smell of damp leaves and faraway smoke. I took a deep breath, exhaled, and gathered what remained. The tape, the letters, and the empty box that had started it all. Then I went to the fireplace, the one I hadn't used since before she died. The grate was cold, but the ashes remembered warmth. I stacked 3 logs, laid a nest of paper beneath them, and struck a match. The flame caught quickly, hungry and bright, spreading its gold into every corner of the room. For a moment, it looked almost alive, the same tender, curious energy I'd felt that night in the mirror. I sat cross-legged on the rug, holding the tape between my palms. The warmth of the fire touched my skin, gentle but insistent. I thought of all the nights I had tried to forget, all the mornings I had woken into silence, believing that not remembering was the same as surviving. And then I thought of her voice, that soft, I know. A sound that didn't belong to death at all, but to love continuing. "I'm not letting you go," I said quietly to the flame. "I'm letting you live somewhere else." I placed the tape into the fire. It curled slowly, plastic bending, ink darkening, the label turning from white to amber. The ribbon inside began to melt, releasing faint curls of smoke that shimmered in the light. For a second, I thought I heard something. A single clear note, like the start of her lullaby. Then it was gone. I fed the letters to the flame next. They burned easily, their words surrendering without resistance. The handwriting dissolved into light. No blame, no shame, just release. The fire didn't roar or crackle, it whispered. It sounded like forgiveness. When it was time, I took the empty cardboard box, the one that had carried everything back to me, and folded it carefully. I placed it on top of the ashes. It caught fire instantly, blooming into gold, then pink, then a deep, soft orange. As it burned, the air seemed to hum. Not a sound I could name, more a vibration, a rhythm, a quiet understanding between worlds. Outside, wind moved through the trees. Leaves scattered across the lawn like small memories changing homes. The house watched with stillness, not mourning, not warning, witnessing. And I realized something I had never understood before. The past doesn't leave because we burn it. It leaves because we finally bless it. When the last ember dimmed, I sat there until only a thin thread of smoke curled upward from the ashes. The light outside had changed. The gray had softened into silver. I opened the window wider and let the smoke drift out into the morning. It rose quietly, carried by a wind that smelled of rain and something faintly sweet. Lilac, maybe, or memory. I whispered to the air, "Take her home." But the words came back softer, inside me, like an echo folding in reverse. "You are home." The fire sighed one last time and went out. In its silence, I felt no emptiness, only space, the kind that makes room for light. I stayed there a while longer, knees drawn close, hands warm from the heat. Outside, children walked to school in their coats, their voices drifting through the morning fog. Life, still happening. Life, unashamed to continue. When I finally stood, I looked at the mirror across the room. The glass was calm, steady, reflecting only what was real. For the first time, I didn't flinch from my own reflection. I saw a woman not haunted by what she lost, but held by what she found. I smiled. It wasn't dramatic, or cinematic, or final. It was quiet. The kind of smile that means the world has stopped being a wound. And somewhere deep inside, I heard a voice. Soft, fading, but free. "Goodbye, Mom," I whispered back. "No, sweetheart, not goodbye. Just thank you." The air shimmered once, like a breath of gold, and then it was still. It has been a year since that morning. A year since the smoke curled through the window and carried her name into the sky. October has come again, quiet, honest, and without disguise. The trees outside have already begun to turn. Their leaves fall softly, not in grief, but in rhythm. Everything breathes slower now, even me. People ask what changed. Nothing and everything. The walls are still the same pale cream. The clock still stands in the hallway. The mirror still hangs above the piano that no one ever learned to play. But the silence, that is different. It doesn't press anymore. It listens. Sometimes I wake at night and expect the old heaviness to return, that pulse of dread that used to live under the floorboards. It doesn't. Instead, I hear the small, steady hum of life, the refrigerator, the wind brushing against the roof, my own breath, unafraid to fill the room. I don't see her anymore. No shadows, no reflections. But I feel her everywhere, in the air that moves when I open the door, in the way the morning light pauses over the dining table before spilling onto the floor. Love never really leaves. It just changes the way it speaks. I kept one thing from that night. Not the tape. That was ash now, but the small metal spool that had once held the ribbon. It survived the fire somehow, untouched by flame, cool and silver. I keep it in a tiny glass jar beside my bed. Sometimes when I can't sleep, I roll it between my fingers and it hums faintly. Not sound, just memory. And I remember that love, like metal, doesn't burn. It transforms. Michael called last spring. His voice was older, thinner. We talked for a while. Not about the past, not even about forgiveness. Just about weather and the garden, and how strange it feels to grow old in a world that still feels new. Before hanging up, he said, "She'd be proud of you." I wanted to tell him I didn't do it for pride. I did it to stop living halfway. But some truths don't need to be spoken. They just need to be shared in silence. Mrs. Eaton from next door came over last week with apple pie. She told me she always knew the house had good bones. I smiled, thinking that maybe she'd been right all along. The house wasn't haunted. It was healing. The mirror, the one that started it all, hangs quietly in the hallway now. Every morning I stop in front of it before leaving the house. Sometimes I say her name under my breath, not to summon her, but to thank her. It's strange, how gratitude and grief can coexist without argument. How a single breath can hold both. This morning, I lit a candle. Not out of fear, not for ceremony, but for remembrance. Its light flickered gently against the mirror's surface, and for a moment, I saw two flames instead of one. Mine and hers. The reflection didn't scare me. It felt like company. Outside, the world moves on. Children in coats walking to school, laughter bouncing down the street, the first chill of winter carrying the promise of warmth to come. And me, standing by the window, holding a cup of tea, letting the quiet happen. I used to think Halloween was the night the dead returned. Now I know it's the night the living remember. It's not about ghosts. It's about permission. The permission to live again without forgetting what we lost. Sometimes I catch myself talking to her still. Not in prayer, not in longing, just in the ordinary ways love persists. Look at the leaves, I'll say. Remember this color. And somehow the air feels like it does. It's strange to think a year ago I was afraid of mirrors. Now every reflection feels like a door that opens both ways, into memory and into the life that kept going. I don't fear the past anymore. I walk beside it. And so, when the wind rises at night and moves through the house, I don't close the windows. I let it in. Because sometimes the dead don't come back to haunt us. They come back to heal us. That's what happened here. A haunting became a homecoming. A silence became a song. And a mirror. Just a mirror now. Learn to breathe without fear. I am Beth Sullivan. And this was my Halloween story. But more than that, this was the night I came home too. If you've stayed until now, thank you. You're part of a quiet circle of souls who still believe that love outlives time. If you wish to keep walking through stories like this, there are more waiting for you here. Listen to another. Maybe it will remember something you've been trying to forget.